Welcome to Silent Revenge. I am Edward Blackthorne, and here we begin. A funeral without tears, a widow's perfect composure, bitter almonds in the air. When Miss Marple uncovers a bigamous marriage and double murder, can you spot the deadly deception first? Where are you listening from, and do you think you can solve it? Think you can beat me to the solution? Which room hides the truth study or greenhouse? The September morning had dawned with that peculiar clarity that often follows rain, washing the world clean and sharp-edged. In the ancient churchyard of Street Mary Mead, the weathered headstones seemed to gleam with renewed purpose, as if death itself had been polished to a respectable shine. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary pew 3 rows from the back, observed the funeral of Mr. Cornelius Ashworth with the quiet attention she reserved for life's more revealing moments. There were, long noted, few occasions that stripped away social pretenses quite like a funeral, though this particular service seemed determined to maintain every possible veneer. The deceased had been the village's most prominent citizen for nearly 2 decades, a retired banker whose influence extended from the parish council to the local magistrate's bench. His sudden death from what Dr. Haydock had termed acute cardiac arrest had shocked the community, though perhaps not entirely surprised those who had witnessed his increasingly volatile temperament in recent months. Mr. Ashworth had possessed the unfortunate combination of great wealth and an even greater certainty of his own righteousness, a combination that, in Miss Marple's experience, rarely led to peaceful endings. What struck her most forcefully about the assembled mourners was not their grief, but rather the careful orchestration of its absence. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, the widow, sat in the front pew like a figure from a Renaissance painting, beautiful, composed, and utterly untouchable. Her black dress was perfectly cut, her veil precisely arranged, and her gloved hands folded with the kind of stillness that suggested either profound sorrow or remarkable self-control. Miss Marple, who had observed both states in their genuine forms, suspected the latter. Ashworth sat her stepdaughter, Miss Catherine Ashworth, a woman of perhaps 30, whose rigid posture spoke of long-practiced endurance. Catherine's relationship with her stepmother had been the subject of considerable village speculation, particularly since old Mr. Ashworth's will had been changed so recently. The girl, though at 30, she was hardly that, kept her eyes fixed on the altar with an intensity that seemed more like concentration than devotion. Dr. Marcus Fielding, the family physician, occupied a prominent position near the front, his distinguished silver hair and grave expression lending appropriate solemnity to the proceedings. Yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept drifting to Mrs. Ashworth with what might have been professional concern, or perhaps something rather more personal. The good doctor had been a widower for some years, and village tongues had begun to whisper about his frequent visits to the Ashworth household in recent months. The service proceeded with mechanical precision. Reverend Morrison delivered a eulogy that managed to praise Mr. Ashworth's civic contributions while carefully avoiding any mention of his character. The hymns were sung with dutiful rather than heartfelt voices. Even the flowers seemed arranged more for effect than sentiment, elaborate displays that spoke of expense rather than affection. It was during the final hymn that Miss Marple noticed the stranger. A young woman, perhaps 25, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, stood at the very back of the church. She wore a simple black dress that suggested modest means, and she clutched a small leather portfolio against her chest as if it contained something precious. Most intriguingly, tears were streaming down her face, the only genuine grief Miss Marple had observed all morning. As the congregation filed out for the graveside service, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose enthusiasm for village drama was matched only by her talent for collecting information. Remarkable composure, Mrs. Bantry whispered, nodding toward the widow. Though I suppose when one is so much younger than one's husband, one must be prepared for such eventualities. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, though her attention was caught by a small detail that others seemed to have missed. Mrs. Ashworth's black gloves, while elegant, bore a faint green stain near the left thumb the kind of mark one might acquire from handling old copper or brass. It was curious. As the Ashworth household was known for its modern appointments and sterling silver. At the graveside, the final stirred, prayers were offered with the same careful formality that had characterized the entire service. As earth was cast upon the polished coffin, Miss Marple observed the reactions of the principal mourners. Mrs. Ashworth remained perfectly composed, though she did remove her gloves to accept condolences, revealing hands that were notably pale except for a thin band of darker skin where a wedding ring had recently been removed and replaced. Dr. Fielding lingered after most of the crowd had dispersed, engaging Mrs. Ashworth in what appeared to be a professional consultation, though their body language suggested a conversation of a more intimate nature. Catherine Ashworth watched this exchange with barely concealed hostility before turning abruptly and walking toward the church. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the young stranger approaching the grave. The woman knelt briefly, placed a single white rose among the elaborate floral arrangements, and whispered something that might have been a prayer or perhaps an apology. As she rose, the leather portfolio slipped from her grasp, spilling several documents onto the grass. Miss Marple, with the helpful instincts of her generation, moved to assist in gathering the scattered papers. In doing so, she caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a birth certificate, though the angle and the young woman's hasty retrieval prevented her from reading the details. What she did notice, however, was the letterhead on one of the documents. It bore the name of a London solicitor's firm, and the date was remarkably recent. "Thank you so much," the young woman said, her voice carrying the refined accent of good education tempered by genuine distress. "I'm afraid I'm rather clumsy when I'm upset." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Grief affects us all differently. Were you acquainted with Mr. Haste, Ashworth?" The question seemed to catch the stranger off guard. For a moment, her composure cracked entirely, revealing something that might have been fear. Yes, in a way. That is, I knew of him. My name is Helen Morrison. Miss Morrison. I've come down from London." Before Miss Marple could respond, Dr. Fielding approached them, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Morrison? I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Dr. Fielding, the family physician. Are you quite well? You look rather pale." The young woman's reaction was immediate and telling. She stepped back as if the doctor represented some kind of threat, her grip tightening on the leather portfolio. "I'm perfectly well, thank you. I was just paying my respects." "Of course," Dr. Fielding said smoothly, though his eyes remained fixed on the portfolio with unmistakable interest. "It's always gratifying to see how widely Mr. Rated Ashworth was respected. Though I must say, I don't recall him mentioning any Morrisons among his London acquaintances." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the church entrance. Mrs. Ashworth was speaking in urgent, low tones to a man Miss Marple didn't recognize, a thin, nervous individual in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. Their conversation appeared to be causing some distress to both parties, and Catherine Ashworth had emerged from the church to observe the exchange with obvious concern. "If you'll excuse me," Miss Morrison said quickly, "I should be getting back to the station." As the young woman hurried away, Dr. Fielding watched her departure with an expression that Miss Marple found decidedly unsettling. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that transformed his distinguished features into something rather less benevolent. The funeral reception was held at Ashworth Manor, an imposing Victorian edifice that had been the family seat for 3 generations. Miss Marple, who had been invited as a matter of village courtesy, found herself observing the social dynamics with her usual quiet attention. The house itself told a story of recent changes. Fresh paint in some rooms, new furnishings that didn't quite match the established decor, and a general sense of transition that suggested someone had been making preparations for a different kind of life. Mrs. Ashworth played the role of grieving widow with consummate skill, accepting condolences with just the right mixture of dignity and vulnerability. Yet Miss Marple noticed that her responses were almost mechanical, as if she had rehearsed them. More tellingly, the widow seemed to be keeping careful track of who was present and what they might be discussing. Catherine Ashworth, meanwhile, moved through the reception like a woman under siege. She spoke little, smiled less, and kept glancing toward the door as if expecting either rescue or further catastrophe. When Miss Marple approached her with gentle condolences, the young woman's response was revealing. "Thank you, Miss Marple, though I must say, it's rather strange to mourn someone who died so conveniently." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Catherine seemed immediately to regret. She excused herself quickly, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the significance of such an observation. It was while she was considering this exchange that the afternoon took its dramatic turn. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been speaking with the nervous man from the churchyard, suddenly swayed and clutched at a nearby chair. Dr. Fielding was at her side immediately, his professional manner taking precedence over whatever personal feelings might have complicated their relationship. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Ashworth is overcome," he announced to the assembled guests. "The strain of the day has been considerable. Perhaps it would be best if everyone—" His words were cut short by a scream from the kitchen. Mrs. Bantry, who had been helping with the refreshments, appeared in the doorway, her face white with shock. "In the pantry," she gasped. "There's been an accident. That young woman, Miss Morrison, she's collapsed. And there's a smell." Fielding rushed toward the kitchen, but Miss Marple was already moving, her mind racing with the implications of that particular scent. Bitter almonds meant only one thing in her experience, and it suggested that Mr. Ashworth's funeral was about to become considerably more complicated. As she reached the pantry door, she could see the young woman's still form on the floor, the leather portfolio scattered beside her, its contents finally revealed. Among the documents, clearly visible now, was a birth certificate that bore the name Helen Morrison and listed Cornelius Ashworth as the father. The peaceful village funeral had just become a double tragedy, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if the timing was entirely coincidental. In her experience, secrets had a way of demanding their due, and the bill for the Ashworth family's secrets was apparently coming due with deadly interest. What dark secrets had died with Cornelius Ashworth, and why had someone been willing to kill to keep them buried? The bitter almond scent hung in the pantry air like an accusation. Dr. Fielding dropped to his knees beside Helen Morrison's still form, his fingers seeking a pulse that Miss Marple already knew he wouldn't find. The young woman's face bore the telltale flush of cyanide poisoning, her fingers still clutched around a small silver locket that had fallen from beneath her dress. "She's gone, Doctor," Fielding announced after a cursory examination, his voice tight with something that might have been professional concern or personal alarm. Heart failure, most likely brought on by the emotional strain of the day. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through his hasty diagnosis. "I think, Doctor, you'll find the circumstances rather more complex than that." She gestured delicately toward the scattered contents of the leather portfolio. Among the legal documents, Helen's birth certificate lay, clearly visible, its stark revelation of Cornelius Ashworth's paternity impossible to ignore. Mrs. Ashworth, who had recovered from her earlier weakness with remarkable speed, moved toward the papers with obvious intent. "Those are private documents," she said sharply, though her perfect composure flickered when her eyes landed on the birth certificate. "Whatever that woman's business here, it died with her." Catherine Ashworth reacted with a raw, visceral gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. The revelation of a secret half-sister, particularly one who had died so mysteriously in their home, cast everything in a chilling new light. Miss Marple quietly retrieved the silver locket from Helen's grasp. Inside its crystal face was a photograph of a much younger Cornelius Ashworth, and beside it, a lock of auburn hair that matched exactly the color of the dead woman's. The evidence was undeniable. Helen Morrison had indeed been Cornelius Ashworth's daughter. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual unfortunate timing, his notebook already at the ready. After a brief examination of the scene, he established the pantry as a crime scene, much to Mrs. Ashworth's visible displeasure. Cyanide poisoning. Dr. Haydock confirmed quietly to Miss Marple as he completed his preliminary examination. Quick and efficient. Someone wanted her silenced permanently. As the inspector began his questioning, Miss Marple noticed something the others had missed. On the kitchen sideboard sat 2 water glasses on mismatched saucers, one blue, one white. The blue saucer's glass showed faint fingerprints and a residue that caught the afternoon light strangely. Someone in this grieving household had been prepared for Helen Morrison's arrival, and they had been prepared to ensure she never left alive. Inspector Slack's methodical approach cut through the household's shocked murmurs like a blade through silk. While the constables secured the scene, he began his questioning with the directness that had earned him both respect and resentment throughout the county. The kitchen staff, already rattled by the morning's events, clustered together like sparrows before a storm. Agnes Pembridge, the longtime housekeeper, proved most illuminating. Her thin hands twisted her apron as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The young lady asked for water when she arrived, Inspector. Said the train journey had left her feeling poorly. But it was Mrs. Ashworth herself who insisted on preparing it, used the good crystal from the dining room. She did. Very particular about which glass the young lady should have." "Miss Marple," observed Mrs. Ashworth's reaction to this revelation with keen interest. The widow's composure, which had seemed so perfectly maintained, showed the faintest crack, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes, that spoke of calculations being rapidly revised. Catherine Ashworth had retreated to the morning room, where she sat among Helen's scattered documents, like a woman surveying the wreckage of her entire world. When Miss Marple approached her, Catherine looked up with eyes that held a mixture of grief and dawning horror. "She was my half-sister," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "All these years, Father never breathed a word. But now I understand why he changed his will so suddenly last month. He must have known she existed, must have been planning to acknowledge her." The implications hung heavy in the air if Cornelius Ashworth had intended to recognize Helen Morrison as his daughter. Both Catherine's inheritance and Mrs. Ashworth's position as primary beneficiary would have been dramatically altered. Dr. Fielding appeared with his medical bag and an expression of professional concern that seemed almost too carefully arranged. "The poor girl appears to have suffered from a weak heart," he announced. The emotional strain of revealing herself to the family proved too much for her constitution. His eagerness to attribute Helen's death to natural causes struck Miss Marple as particularly telling, especially when she noticed him glance meaningfully toward Mrs. Ashworth, before continuing his explanation. It was then that Constable Jenkins called from the scullery. "Inspector, found a small glass vial hidden behind the drain pipe still reeks of bitter almonds." The discovery sent a visible tremor through the assembled household, and Miss Marple couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hands had begun to tremble ever so slightly. The glass vial's discovery sent a visible tremor through the assembled household, transforming grief into something far more dangerous. Inspector Slack examined the container with professional detachment, noting the fresh fingerprints clearly visible on its surface. "Someone took considerable care to hide this," he announced grimly, "but not quite careful enough." Mrs. Ashworth's response was swift and calculated. "Inspector, surely you don't suspect anyone in this house?" That poor girl was clearly disturbed coming here with wild claims about her parentage. Perhaps she brought the poison herself, intending some desperate gesture that went tragically wrong. Miss Marple observed the widow's performance with quiet interest. The suggestion was clever, deflecting suspicion while painting Helen Morrison as an unstable interloper. Yet, something in Mrs. Ashworth's tone suggested she was working from a prepared script, as if she had anticipated this very moment. Catherine Ashworth's reaction was immediate and fierce. Helen wasn't disturbed, she was desperate. There's a difference. She held up one of the scattered documents with shaking hands. Look at this letter from Father's London solicitor, dated just 2 weeks ago. He was arranging to meet with her, to discuss what he called matters of family significance. She didn't come here to make wild claims. She came because Father had summoned her. The revelation struck like a physical blow. Dr. Fielding's face drained of color, while Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "That's impossible," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Cornelius would have told me about any such arrangements." Miss Marple examined the solicitor's letter with interest. The firm was Pemberton, Wickham and Associates, highly respectable, and not given to frivolous correspondence. More intriguingly, the letter referenced certain provisions that Mr. Ashworth wished to make, suggesting financial arrangements that would have significantly impacted the existing will. While Inspector Slack methodically took fingerprints, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Ashworth discreetly wipe her left thumb with a handkerchief, as if to erase some invisible stain. The same thumb that had borne that curious green mark at the funeral. Agnes Pembridge, summoned again, repeated her statement with dogged precision. Mrs. Ashworth, brought. The glass from the dining room herself. Inspector. Wouldn't let anyone else touch it, said the young lady. Looked faint and must have water at once. As the constables secured the evidence, Miss Marple quietly examined the 2 water glasses on their mismatched sources. One bore a faint crescent mark on the rim lipstick, delicately imprinted. Helen Morrison had worn none, but Mrs. Ashworth's carefully applied rosewood shade would leave just such a trace. The lipstick trace on the glass rim spoke volumes to Miss Marple's trained eye, though she made no mention of it to Inspector Slack, who remained focused on the more obvious evidence. Small details, she had learned, often proved more revealing than dramatic gestures, and this particular detail suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the crime from desperate impulse to calculated murder. Dr. Fielding's demeanor had shifted markedly since the discovery of the poison vial. His earlier professional composure had given way to nervous energy that manifested in restless pacing and frequent, anxious glances toward Mrs. Ashworth. When Inspector Slack approached him for a formal statement, his response was notably defensive. "I barely spoke to the young woman," he insisted, though perspiration beaded on his distinguished forehead despite the cool September air. "She seemed perfectly healthy when she arrived, perhaps emotional, but hardly unusual under the circumstances. Her collapse was entirely unexpected." Miss Marple noted how carefully he avoided mentioning his earlier eagerness to attribute Helen's death to natural causes, and how his eyes continually sought Mrs. Ashworth's face, as if seeking reassurance or guidance. Meanwhile, Catherine Ashworth had retreated to her father's study, where she sat surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and personal correspondence. When Miss Marple found her there, Catherine looked up with eyes that held both grief and dawning comprehension. "There are gaps in Father's recent papers," Catherine said quietly. "Significant gaps. Letters that should be here aren't particularly anything from the past 6 months involving London solicitors or financial arrangements. Father was meticulous about his records. He never discarded important documents without making copies." It was then that Agnes Pembridge appeared in the doorway, her face pale with distress. "Begging your pardon, Miss Catherine, but there's something you should know about the morning your father died." She wrung her hands nervously. "I found him collapsed over his desk, but before I called Dr. Fielding, I noticed a letter in his hand, half burned in the fireplace grate. I could only make out 'my daughter Helen' and something about making amends before the doctor arrived and took it away." Dr. Haydock, having completed his examination of Helen's body, drew Miss Marple aside with a troubled expression. "This business makes me uneasy about Ashworth's own death," he murmured quietly. "There was something I dismissed at the time, a faint scent, a curious flush. Now I wonder if I was too hasty in my conclusions." The implication hung heavy in the air. Had both father and daughter been murdered? Dr. Haydock's troubled admission sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the September air. Inspector Slack, recognizing the gravity of the implication, closed his notebook with decisive authority. Right then, I'll be requesting an immediate post-mortem examination of Mr. Pentis. Ashworth's remains. If we're dealing with a double murder, every hour counts. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was swift and telling. Her carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, and she swayed against the doorframe with what appeared to be genuine distress. Inspector, surely you cannot be serious. My husband was buried mere hours ago. The shock of such a suggestion. Dr. Fielding moved immediately to support her, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled as he guided Mrs. Ashworth to a nearby chair. The intimate familiarity of the gesture, combined with his obvious nervousness, painted a picture that grew more troubling by the moment. Catherine Ashworth, meanwhile, had retreated to her father's study with renewed purpose. The revelation that both her father and half-sister might have been murdered had transformed her grief into something resembling fierce determination. When Miss Marple found her there, Catherine was methodically searching through desk drawers with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she sought. "There," Catherine whispered triumphantly, producing a small brass key from behind a loose panel. Father always kept his most important documents separate from his regular papers. The key opened a locked drawer that revealed a cache of correspondence with the London solicitors, including a draft codicil to Cornelius Ashworth's will. The document was devastating in its implications. Dated just days before his death, it formally acknowledged Helen Morrison as his natural daughter and provided for a substantial inheritance that would have dramatically reduced both Mrs. Ashworth's portion and Catherine's own expectations. Agnes Pembridge appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands with obvious distress. "Begging your pardon, Miss Catherine, but I must tell the inspector something. 2 nights before the master died, I saw Mrs. Ashworth in here very late, working at that very drawer. She had on her gardening gloves, said her hands were cold. But the next morning, I noticed she'd moved things about. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets lay buried in the shadows of Ashworth Manor." Agnes Pembridge's revelation about the gardening gloves struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. In her long experience, people who wore gloves indoors while handling papers were usually concerned about leaving fingerprints a level of premeditation that suggested careful planning rather than crimes of passion. Inspector Slack examined the draft codicil with growing interest. The document not only acknowledged Helen Morrison as Cornelius Ashworth's natural daughter, but also provided her with an inheritance of £20,000, a substantial sum that would have dramatically reduced both Mrs. Ashworth's portion and Catherine's expectations. The codicil was dated just 3 days before Ashworth's death, suggesting he had been preparing to make these changes when death intervened so conveniently. Dr. Fielding's nervousness had escalated to barely controlled panic. When Inspector Slack questioned him about his final visit to the deceased, his answers became increasingly evasive. Cornelius was agitated that evening, yes, but he'd been under considerable strain. "Business matters, you understand. I prescribed a mild sedative to help him sleep." Miss Marple observed how carefully he avoided specifying what those business matters might have been, and how his eyes kept seeking Mrs. Ashworth's face as if looking for silent guidance. Catherine Ashworth had made another discovery among her father's hidden papers, a series of bank statements showing regular monthly payments of £50 to a London address over the past 18 months. The address matched exactly the one on Helen Morrison's correspondence. "Father had been supporting her all this time," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with dawning comprehension. "He knew about Helen and was providing for her. But why the secrecy? Why not acknowledge her openly?" Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with renewed composure, though something cold and dangerous flickered in her eyes. "Because your father understood the importance of discretion. He would never have legitimized such irregularities, no matter how much misplaced guilt he might have felt." The venom, in her carefully modulated tone, was unmistakable. and Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hands clenched into fists as she spoke. The careful facade of the grieving widow was finally beginning to crack. It was then that Constable Jenkins returned from searching the grounds, carrying a small gardening trowel wrapped in evidence cloth. "Found this buried beneath the rose bushes near the kitchen garden, Inspector. Still has traces of that same greenish residue we noticed on the glove." The gardening trowel's discovery sent a visible tremor through the assembled household, transforming the afternoon's revelations into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack examined the implement with methodical precision, noting how the greenish residue clung to its blade despite obvious attempts at cleaning. The substance bore the distinctive patina of copper compounds, the same telltale stain Miss Marple had observed on Mrs. Ashworth's funeral gloves. Dr. Fielding's reaction was immediate and damning. His distinguished features drained of color as he stepped backward, as if the evidence itself posed a physical threat. "Inspector, surely you cannot think that garden tool has any bearing on these tragic circumstances. Such implements are commonplace in any well-maintained household." His protest rang hollow, particularly when Mrs. Ashworth fixed him with a look of such venomous intensity that even Inspector Slack noticed the charged exchange. The careful choreography of their relationship was beginning to unravel, revealing something far more dangerous beneath the surface. It was then that Constable Jenkins approached with another discovery. "Inspector, we've found the source. The old greenhouse behind the kitchen garden, there's a brass fumigation canister inside, still reeking of bitter almonds. The seal's been broken recently." The greenhouse proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. Against the far wall stood the antique fumigation equipment, its copper fittings green with verdigris. A tin of cyanide tablets sat nearby, its wax seal freshly broken. Miss Marple noticed how a tiny thread of dove-grey fabric clung to the rough metal edge fabric that matched exactly the subtle weave of Dr. Fielding's funeral attire. Agnes Pembridge, summoned once more, provided crucial testimony. "Mrs. Ashworth keeps the greenhouse keys in the morning room cabinet. Inspector, she's particular about the roses and often tends them personally when Mr. Evans is away." The revelation was interrupted by the arrival of a thin, nervous man, whom Miss Marple recognized from the churchyard, the same individual who had spoken so urgently with Mrs. Ashworth after the burial. "Owen Latchford, sir." He introduced himself to Inspector Slack, his hat crushed between trembling hands. "Clerk to Pemberton, Wickham and Associates. I was instructed to deliver a letter to Miss Helen Morrison, but Mr. Ashworth specified that if he were indisposed, I should give it to his wife for proper delivery." The implications struck like a physical blow. Mrs. Ashworth had received the very letter that would have brought Helen Morrison to the house at the appointed time, knowing exactly when and how to prepare for her arrival. Catherine Ashworth's voice cut through the stunned silence. "You gave her the letter meant for Helen, the letter that would have warned her about the codicil?" Latchford nodded miserably. "Mrs. Ashworth assured me that Miss Morrison had come and gone safely. I had no reason to doubt." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Ashworth's composure was finally cracking, her carefully maintained facade giving way to something cold and calculating. The widow's gloved hands clenched into fists as the net of evidence tightened around her, and her eyes sought Dr. Fielding's face with desperate intensity. The weight of Owen Latchford's revelation settled over Ashworth Manor like a shroud, transforming the afternoon's careful choreography into something far more sinister. Mrs. Ashworth's composure, which had weathered the discovery of the poison vial and the greenhouse evidence, finally began to show genuine cracks under the mounting pressure of Inspector Slack's methodical questioning. "Mrs. Ashworth," the inspector continued with deliberate precision, "you received correspondence intended for Miss Morrison, yet maintained she arrived unannounced. Would you care to explain this discrepancy?" The widow's response came too quickly, betraying the careful preparation behind her words. "Inspector, I merely sought to protect my late husband's reputation from what appeared to be fraudulent claims. The young woman's documents could have been fabricated, her story designed to extract money from a grieving family. Dr. Fielding's reaction to this explanation was immediate and telling. His distinguished features drained of color as he stepped away from Mrs. Ashworth, as if her proximity had become suddenly dangerous. The careful alliance that had sustained them through the morning's revelations was beginning to fracture under the weight of evidence. It was then that Mr. Evans, the gardener, arrived from his neighboring estate, his weathered hands still bearing the scent of soil and honest labor. His testimony proved devastating in its simplicity. The greenhouse key hangs in the morning room cabinet, Inspector. Day before the master died, I was called away sudden-like. When I returned the next morning, the key was back in its place, but the wax seal on the cyanide tin looked disturbed. I mentioned it to Mrs. Ashworth. She said she'd see to polishing the brass fittings herself. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Ashworth's gloved hands clenched involuntarily at this revelation, and how her eyes sought Dr. Fielding's face with increasing desperation. The careful partnership that had orchestrated 2 murders was dissolving into mutual suspicion and fear. Catherine Ashworth, who had been searching through more of her father's papers, approached with trembling hands. "Inspector, I've found something else. Correspondence between Dr. Fielding and my stepmother, dating back months before father's death. They discuss what they call removing obstacles to their future happiness. The letters were damning in their intimacy and their implications. Dr. Fielding had provided detailed medical advice about untraceable substances, while Mrs. Ashworth had outlined her husband's daily routines and vulnerabilities with clinical precision. Dr. Fielding's composure finally shattered completely. "Vivienne, you assured me we were acting mercifully," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You said Cornelius was suffering, that a peaceful end would spare him pain." Mrs. Ashworth's mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath her carefully maintained facade. "Your weakness has destroyed everything, Marcus. If you had simply maintained your nerve, we might have survived this scrutiny." Miss Marple stepped forward, with quiet authority, her gentle voice cutting through the mounting tension. "I think, Inspector, you'll find that mercy had very little to do with Mr. Ashworth's death. The timing was far too convenient, coming just as he prepared to acknowledge his natural daughter and alter his will accordingly." Miss Marple's gentle observation seemed to unlock the final pieces of the puzzle, and she continued with the quiet authority that had served her so well in previous investigations. The sequence becomes quite clear when one considers the careful planning required for both murders. Mrs. Ashworth discovered her husband's intentions not through accident, but through systematic surveillance of his correspondence. She gestured toward the scattered papers with delicate precision. The gaps in his recent files weren't random, they were methodical. Someone with intimate knowledge of his habits removed specific documents while leaving others untouched. The gardening gloves Agnes mentioned weren't for warmth, but to avoid leaving fingerprints on papers that would later need to disappear. Dr. Fielding's composure had completely collapsed, his distinguished features now bearing the weight of unbearable guilt. The careful alliance that had sustained him through the morning's revelations was crumbling under Miss Marple's methodical reconstruction. "You see, Inspector," Miss Marple continued gently, "Helen Morrison's murder required different planning entirely. Mrs. Ashworth knew from the solicitor's letter exactly when the young woman would arrive. The water glass, with the lipstick trace, you tested it first, didn't you, Mrs. Ashworth, to ensure the poison would work quickly enough?" Mrs. Ashworth's silence was more damning than any confession, but her eyes blazed with desperate defiance. "Nonsense. You're weaving fantasies from coincidence and speculation." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded pleasantly, "though it's curious how the glass Helen Morrison drank from was the good crystal you personally selected, while the water glass on the blue saucer remained untouched, and the small vial of cyanide hidden behind the pantry drain pipe, a location only someone intimately familiar with the kitchen would choose." She turned her gentle gaze to Dr. Fielding, whose thread of dove-grey fabric had connected him directly to the greenhouse fumigator. The brass fittings left their telltale green residue on both the gardening trowel and your gloves. Doctor, evidence of your access to the poison source. Dr. Fielding's voice emerged as barely a whisper. She said it would be peaceful. A small dose in his evening brandy, he would simply drift away in his sleep. She convinced me it was merciful, that his heart condition made death inevitable anyway. Agnes Pembridge stepped forward reluctantly. The morning the master died, Mrs. Ashworth asked me to dispose of his brandy decanter, said it had developed a crack. But when I examined it, the crystal was perfect. She insisted I pour the contents down the drain immediately. Mrs. Ashworth's facade finally shattered completely. "Marcus! You fool! Your weakness has destroyed everything we worked for." Inspector Slack moved forward with handcuffs ready. "Vivienne, Ashworth, and Dr. Marcus Fielding, I arrest you for the murders of Cornelius Ashworth and Helen Morrison." As the arrests proceeded, Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet satisfaction, though one final revelation remained, and she suspected it would prove the most shocking of all. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mrs. Ashworth's composure transformed into something far more dangerous than mere desperation. Her carefully maintained facade of grieving widowhood fell away entirely, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated 2 murders with chilling precision. Miss Marple stepped forward with her characteristic gentleness, though her eyes held steely determination. "There's one final element to consider, Inspector. Mrs. Ashworth's marriage to Cornelius Ashworth was itself built on deception. She produced a document from Helen Morrison's scattered papers, one that had been overlooked in the earlier confusion. The aged parchment bore the official seal of a London registry office, its formal script still clearly legible despite the passage of years. This is a marriage certificate from 1895, showing that Cornelius Ashworth was married to one Margaret Helen Morrison in London. Helen wasn't simply his natural daughter, she was his legitimate child from his first marriage. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Catherine Ashworth's face went white as the implications became clear, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "That means Helen was father's legal heir, not his illegitimate daughter. And that means, Miss Marple continued gently, Mrs. Ashworth's marriage to your father was bigamous. Margaret Morrison never died. As the family was led to believe, she simply disappeared from Cornelius's life when circumstances became difficult. Helen Morrison was seeking not charity, but her rightful inheritance as the legitimate Mrs. Ashworth's daughter." Dr. Fielding stared at his accomplice with growing horror, the full extent of his manipulation finally becoming clear. "Vivienne, you told me Helen was blackmailing him. You said she threatened to expose some youthful indiscretion unless he paid her increasingly large sums." Mrs. Ashworth's laugh was brittle and cold, all pretense finally abandoned. Helen Morrison was no blackmailer, Marcus. She was something far more dangerous. She was genuinely his daughter, with genuine legal claim to everything I had worked 20 years to secure. The monthly payments weren't extortion, they were paternal support. Cornelius was planning to bring her into the family properly, to acknowledge her legitimate status and provide her with the inheritance that was rightfully hers. Inspector Slack examined the marriage certificate with growing comprehension. The document was authentic, properly witnessed, and predated Mrs. Ashworth's own ceremony by 15 years. Helen Morrison hadn't come to claim charity, she had come to claim her birthright as the daughter of the true Mrs. Cornelius Ashworth. "You killed them both to protect a lie," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. "To maintain a marriage that was never legal." Mrs. Ashworth's eyes blazed with unrepentant fury. "I gave him respectability, social position, everything that mattered. That woman was nothing, a shopkeeper's daughter who trapped him with pregnancy and a hasty marriage." But Miss Marple had noticed something else among Helen's papers, something that would prove even more devastating than the marriage certificate itself. Miss Marple unfolded the final document from Helen Morrison's portfolio with characteristic gentleness, a letter written in neat feminine script, addressed to Catherine Ashworth, and dated just 2 days before the funeral. "My dear Catherine," Miss Marple read softly before passing it to Inspector Slack, who handed it to Catherine with respectful solemnity. "I am frightened to come, though the solicitor assures me father wishes this done properly. He says nothing is meant to be taken from you, there is to be a trust in both our names. I shall have enough to start a small school, and you will keep the house. He asks me to meet you kindly, and I hope to know my sister at last. Forgive me if I seem awkward. Your sister, Helen." The words settled over the room like a benediction. Catherine read twice, her tears finally coming not from grief, but from understanding the kindness that had been so brutally prevented. "She meant no harm," Catherine whispered. "Father intended generosity, not disruption." Ashworth's composure cracked completely. "She would have destroyed everything I built. 20 years of respectability, of position, all threatened by some shopkeeper's daughter with her pathetic documents." Inspector Slack's voice was grim. 2 murders to protect a lie. "Mrs. Ashworth, your marriage was bigamous, your position fraudulent, and your actions unforgivable." As the arrests proceeded, Dr. Fielding's confession came in broken fragments. He had believed Mrs. Ashworth's portrayal of Cornelius as a cruel man who deserved a merciful death. The brandy had been his contribution, a physician's supposed kindness. Helen's murder had been entirely Mrs. Ashworth's design. Letter intercepted, timing calculated, poison prepared with methodical precision. The subsequent investigation confirmed Dr. Haydock's suspicions. Exhumation revealed cyanide in Cornelius Ashworth's remains, and the inquest delivered its inevitable verdict. The village, as villages do, absorbed the scandal with a mixture of horror and fascination. Catherine, inheriting her father's estate through proper legal channels, established a scholarship for village girls wishing to teach Helen Morrison's name, ensuring that her brief life would nurture others' futures. She kept Helen's locket, wearing it quietly as remembrance of the sister she'd never known. Miss Marple returned to her garden with characteristic serenity. When Mrs. Bantry visited, full of theories and admiration, she insisted. "You knew from the beginning, Jane." Miss Marple smiled gently, pruning a wayward rose. "One notices when grief is rehearsed rather than felt, dear. And there are small things, stains on new gloves, a decanter discarded for imaginary cracks, a doctor too eager with his diagnoses. People reveal themselves if one simply observes. Still, to see it so clearly, it's never clear at first," Miss Marple reflected softly. "One has only experience. I once knew someone who kept a cat and canary in perfect harmony until the milk ran short. When comfort is threatened, people remember what they truly are." The village eventually found its rhythm again, though forever changed by the funeral without tears and the secrets that had demanded such a terrible price.